So I just yesterday discovered Ted Honderich or Honderich. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. He wrote this paper called Consciousness as Existence and the End of Intentionality. And I think Ted, I think he's passed away, but I think he was saying something very close to what I'm saying, right? My own theory of consciousness is close to his. He says consciousness as existence. He uses words like actualism. It's a different lingo, but I think it's the same demystifying intention. Consciousness is the presence. Consciousness is the quality of the physical, for instance, of every kind of entity, and notably of entities that are called physical. Now, I imagine Ted found himself misunderstood in the way that I think that I find myself misunderstood. Now, being misunderstood, this is a kind of situated judgment. You sort of launch signs out there into the marketplace, and some people will launch signs back at you, and you think, okay, yeah, I think this person gets me. So there's a couple of people I'm in conversation with, and I feel like, they're not misunderstanding me. But as Ted talks about in various papers, if you have an interesting theory of consciousness, if you make progress, it makes sense that you probably will be misunderstood, right? Now, you might come to say, oh, I was lying to myself, this isn't actually a good theory, or there was something wrong with this theory that I just would not see. And I would say that this could happen to anyone at any time, but if you dwell on a theory, and if you get a sense of a more and more coherent grip, a more and more overall ontological picture, then you will start to think, okay, what is obscure? What gets in the way? How is one being misunderstood? And of course, I'm thinking about myself, but also, like, why is Mach not discussed more in philosophy? Why did it take me so long to find Ted Honderich in the first place? For one thing, I was Googling things like consciousness as being, right? I wasn't using the word existence because, coming from Heidegger and German philosophy, it was more natural to say being rather than existence. But really, existence is a fine alternative, right? It's not like a particular word choice is decisive. You have to look at paragraphs, right? You have to see how a philosopher expands. You have to see what they're trying to summarize with, my theory is that consciousness is existence, or my theory is that consciousness is being, is presence, is quality. Okay, so I think if I could talk to Ted, I think, like I said, I think he's deceased, but I think we would probably hash it out and probably find some sort of pleasantly shared common territory, right? So what might we agree obscures this issue? Like, if this is a good belief, if this is a good way to understand consciousness, why is it not more common? And that's an interesting question to me. So, of course, I've talked about this elsewhere, but I think ingredient ontology is such a powerful default, a failure to recognize the ontological difference. So this is one of the reasons I'm lately, playing with the label positivist, neo-positivist, a kind of neo-logical positivist, because people tend to think this kind of theory about consciousness is too idealistic. They think that you're reducing the world to a system of container subjects, right? And there's a lot of people that are into Kastrup, and there's a lot of people who basically are religiously oriented, and they do want consciousness to play not the role that I want it to play. They want it to play the role of a fundamental stuff. Now, I can relate to why people would be tempted to say, well, consciousness makes more sense as a fundamental stuff than physicality or matter, because I think what they want to affirm is that the world is there as quality. The world is qualitatively there. It stinks, it burns, it shines, it rings. The world is there, and this there-ness of the world, which is a there-ness for, we might say, this is what I think people most want to say with the word consciousness. Now, it's a complex concept, right? But I think the fundamental thread of this concept is something like ontological consciousness, which is, in my view, and I think Ted's view, equivalent to the presence or the presencing of the world, the presence of the physical. So how is this misunderstood? So he calls cranialism the view that he opposes, right? But people will hear this idea that consciousness is being, consciousness is existence. They're going to probably hear this in terms of the very cranialism that is being rejected. And this is why William James said that consciousness did not exist. And yet he was definitely acknowledging what you might call the quality or the presence of physical things, right? But what he saw was that consciousness was given these various confusing, incoherent roles to play. So in his Principles of Psychology already, he was attacking the idea of a transcendental ego. It's as if he saw that there was this phenomenal stream, but there was no ego. The phenomenal stream was definitely continuous. It was a kind of temporal context, a contexture that was unified in some sense, I would say, through anticipation, memory, and habit. But I think James was right, and I think he echoes Hume here, because Hume, he couldn't find an ego or a self. I mentioned George Lakoff recently. He looks into what drives mathematical mystification, and he also looks into how concepts function. So I think we might be able to summarize some of his work this way. We humans are intensely metaphorical animals. Douglas Hofstadter, his later work is all about metaphoricity. So if you look at set theory as a kind of foundational theory of mathematics, what do you have? What is the set? I would say, in some sort of primitive cognitive terms, the set is a container. So this container metaphor, it plays a role in the foundations of mathematics. It seems to play an intense role in what you might call fundamental ontology or metaphysics. And so you get the container subject, and you get sort of a Cartesian, it's bigger than Descartes, but he's famously associated with it. But you get an inside versus an outside, the idea of some sort of mediating screen, mediating qualia, representational icons, the user interface. So what's interesting, I would consider my theory anti-dualist, post-dualist, anti-representational. And people who take all of that stuff for granted, and to take it for granted is to not even realize that you have it as a dominant theory, right? The theory is so deep in you, you don't even know it's a theory. I'm not saying everyone's like this, but I would say that my younger self was definitely like this. This is why, studying Heidegger, for instance, for one thing, it can be difficult, off-putting, confusing, but if you hang in there, and for me it was the early work especially, then you do come out on the other side, and you can sort of see this powerful trend in philosophy and in Western culture from the outside for the first time, really. But, I don't really want to talk about Dasein all day and use exotic German words, because I really think A.J. Ayer is great, Ernst Mach, the logical positivist. They were uptight. They were too close-minded and dogmatic about certain things, but the general idea that philosophy is a kind of explication or clarification of concepts, that philosophy was not a kind of super science. I like that, and their general secular critical attitude, I think, is great. Now, a lot of people who read Heidegger, they don't like the word consciousness very much, and I understand, right? Because they have absorbed this critique of Cartesianism, and since most people think about consciousness in dualist terms, it's going to remind them. They're going to think, oh, you're just trying to do dualism again. But no, I'm trying to personally sort of naturalize not only Heidegger, but I'm trying to take some of the things I got from Heidegger and bring them back into a kind of positivistic tonality. I think there's certain advantages to this. Heidegger, the later Heidegger, it comes off as mystical, poetic, literary. I'm not saying it doesn't have value, but it can work against your case, right? There's so much sort of mysticism or religion and talk of consciousness, right? This issue is so loaded. And I think this is one of the things that kind of obscures the issue. So, somebody with a kind of, there's definitely an objective reality, objective physical reality, I would say that would be, in the metaphysical phase, which comes after the theological phase, but before the positivistic, instrumental, and truly scientific phase. I mean, it's largely a matter of attitude, and you see a kind of, again, tacit or presupposed identification of science with the pursuit of metaphysical truth. And people might not say that, it's the pursuit of metaphysical truth, but I think what I would call scientism in philosophy, this is what is sort of indicated in the tonality, in the seriousness with which, not just the seriousness in inquiry is not a bad thing, but the fundamental assumption of mirroring. And if people ask for empirical evidence for ontological explications, this shows that for them philosophy is still a kind of quasi-physics or superphysics. Now, one of the things I like about Ted, and I've read a few of his papers. I haven't really got to dig in enough, but we have access to consciousness. To put it in very ordinary terms, we're trying to explicate what is immediate, right? But what is this immediacy, right? So you're trying to use almost a phenomenological method of finding these sort of illuminating phrases that point, that foreground, and then you want a kind of system of concepts that is economical, internally coherent. Now, personally, one of my motives is to save the empirical object as empirical. And this is where the empiricism, the positivism, is also a rhetorical aid, right? I'm not interested in rescuing theology by, introducing some occult substance conception of consciousness. It's like, there's this magical stuff that science can never explain. Now, can science explain presence or quality in general? I don't even know what that would mean. So I'm not somebody who thinks that anything and everything can be explained, right? There might be something that's a brute fact, but I wouldn't want to block the way of inquiry. But the point is, for one thing, it's not a pose. My positivism is coming from a very secular place. So my objection to the kind of scientism that is so suspicious of this approach to consciousness is that it's too metaphysical. And my critique is an old critique, right? It's the immaterialist critique, but really it's the critique of dualism. So when people postulate some sort of absolute reality stuff that they call matter or the physical, this almost always comes, explicitly or not, with the idea that experience is somehow secondary, unreal, or representational. So, you find this already in Locke, who basically says that color is not real. Now, this is odd. We're saying the immediate is not real in the name of something that gets projected and becomes more and more obscure. And Nietzsche wrote a famous passage about how the real world became a fable, an illusion. I think it's in Twilight of the Idols. So from my point of view, the metaphysical phase that's between the theological phase and the positivistic phase, it is accidentally theological and mystified, in that it has some sort of divine substance that's projected into the mist. And instead of statues and temples, you have equations, you have Platonistic dream worlds of pure form, equations that summarize to some degree and in some context, measurements become more real than the thing that was measured. It's almost like the shadow is taken to be more real than the object that cast the shadow. And you can see this Platonism of the cave allegory, taken to fun and wild and questionable extremes by Donald Hoffman. But even Dennett talked about user illusion, user interface. He read Wittgenstein, right? And this surprises me, right? Because I feel like Wittgenstein is a great critic of naive dualist tendencies. I haven't studied Chalmers in depth, but I've read like a little bit on the hard problem, and it seems to me that he also takes consciousness to be some kind of stuff that would be difficult to explain in terms of some other kind of stuff that is considered relatively explicable and available, right? The physical. And what I've called the hard problem of the physical, what is the availability of the physical but consciousness? The presence, availability, or there-ness of the physical, that's kind of what I want to call consciousness. That would be an oversimplification, but it's as if the presence of the object is sort of scraped off and made into some other stuff that is present beside the object, that was originally present. Now, if you scrape off the presence and the quality of the physical, you don't have anything left. But in this world, what do you have left? You have mathematical symbols on particular pages, on particular screens. All of this involves quality or presence or consciousness. But you might say that these symbols are taken to somehow gesture behind all manifestation. Now, I have no objection to postulating, new particles, postulating things that are not directly accessible to the senses. I have no problem at all with this. This would be physics, or you could have depth psychology, the idea of the unconscious. I have no problem with including, entities that are not directly available. They're part of a total, causal inferential nexus. But what I think is a bad idea is when sort of philosophy as explication accidentally becomes a kind of pseudoscience, and it thinks it's it kind of has an identity crisis. So consciousness being treated as some kind of stuff that needs to be explained in terms of other kinds of stuff, this seems to me like a serious mistake. So in that sense, the hard problem would be a kind of a pseudo-problem, or a problem generated by a framework with incoherent presuppositions. Now, I think just about everyone who's thought, my kind of approach, which is not only mine, but I think the typical reaction, the typical negative reaction to this approach is that it's, in quotes, too idealistic. And usually if you politely push these people and find out what they believe, this is my picture of what so many people believe, right? This is a kind of archetypal picture. There's going to be variance. But you have a system of container subjects, right? And then some sort of truth-making external or substrate reality. So what they assume is that everybody is trapped in a bubble of user interface. Now, to me, this is too idealistic. This is wild to presuppose that everybody's in a kind of user illusion. Everybody's in a sort of private version of Plato's cave. So you might say that what my theory is doing, and it's not really just mine, it's denying that we're in a cave. It's saying that consciousness is just the presence of the shared world itself, the presence of the physical. The physical includes its quality or presence. And we're not excluding all the causal relationships and all the postulated entities. Now, if you just assume a system of container subjects, almost like little silos, right? Everybody's stuck in a private movie, and then the movie sort of gets transmissions from substrate reality, and then the movie tries to represent. It's almost like Freud's theory of dreams, where there's a dream distortion. This is a wild theory. There's like one sort of God computer truth-making substrate reality that sends little messages that have to be mediated and transformed into private experience. This is what Ted is calling cranialism, the sense that, everybody's experience is this stuff in their head, even though it seems like they're experiencing the shared life world. That's a kind of user illusion. Now, as I've said before, nobody lives like this. Nobody acts on this belief. You might say that we mostly live as naive realists. So just that incoherence, right? We're repeating some sort of Humean vanity, you might say. Hume at least pointed it out that, he had these really weird theories that implied everybody was in a sort of bubble in his study, but then he would leave the room and forget all that stuff and play backgammon, drink some gin or whatever. Empirical science is, based on experience, right? And experience is situated and personal. Now, it's interpersonal, it's intersubjective. If we believe we share a world, if we believe that the word that you can hear yourself saying is the same word that I can hear you saying, but I hear it through my ears while you hear it through your ears. So basically, you might say, to make this theory work, let's say that it's a research thesis. Like, okay, let's explore the idea that consciousness is the presence of the physical, that we really do share these objects. Maybe not perfectly, but overall our beliefs sufficiently overlap. We share objects in a sufficiently synchronized way that we can mostly make sense to one another. Well, what then is the structure of the physical object? And I've suggested a kind of object-splintered ontology. Now, Ted doesn't go into this, or I haven't got to that part of his work. It's related to an ontological perspectivism, related to the monadology, but the problem with Leibniz is he did sort of take the system of container subjects, right? But what I like about the monadology is he solved that objects manifest in a situated way, which is to say from a point of view, this side of the object or that side, and so on. And objects also manifest in what you might call a temporal context in terms of a subject's memory, anticipation, and habits of response. So you might say, well, isn't this a system of container subjects, but there's just no more substrate reality. There's no more objective, true reality. Well, I would say you can look at the world that way. It would be one way to look at the world's structure. You could look at the rows of a chessboard or the columns of the chessboard. You could say that the world can be viewed as a system of phenomenal streams, but you can also look and see that the phenomenal streams are constituted by shared objects, by faces or aspects or moments of shared objects. And I agree with Venerius. The sharedness of the world is presupposed and fundamental for philosophy. So I would even say that it's sort of better to see phenomenal streams as constituted by shared life world objects, that the objects really are central. We're so entangled, our very identities depend on one another. So yes, I do think you can look at the world as a in terms of the contents of a system of phenomenal streams, but you could also look at the world as a shared life world that is sort of shattered, a bit like a chandelier. What Ted does get right, I think he uses the phrase radical externalism. Like, if you just want to be true to like the facts, true to basic experience, the objects are very much experienced as outside of my head, and possibly threatening. Maybe there's water over there. I'm thirsty. The objects are outside of the empirical flesh and blood person who needs these objects or is endangered by these objects. This would, in phenomenological terms, be the transcendence of objects. But immanence and transcendence somewhat echo the inside-outside language that I would like to get completely beyond, right? I would like to get completely beyond representationalism.